This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. Brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a veteran scholar of conflict and peace, a professor of peace and reconciliation at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. He is the author of several books, most recently The Two State Delusion, Israel-Palestine, A Tale of Two Narratives, that was published recently by Viking. The book is in fact an extensively researched coroner's report of what for many decades has been thought to be the solution to the protracted and seemingly intractable conflict in the Middle East. Professor Padraig O'Malley, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you for having me here.
So the premise of your book is that the two-state solution is very unlikely to see the light of day for myriad reasons. But even if it did, it will not be viable. Mm-hmm. So let me start by asking you this. Was it ever viable? And if so, when did things take a turn for the worse?
I think it may have been viable early after post-67 and even perhaps up to when Mr. Netanyahu became president in 2008, and then the doubling of the settlements under his presidency, the vast increase in people living in the Middle East, Jews living in the Middle East, kind of make the Clinton parameters, Arab neighborhoods for Arabs, Jewish neighborhoods for Jews, kind of makes them irrelevant.
Mm-hmm. So the turning point is pretty recent. I mean, we're talking about less than 10 years ago.
And other things have happened, of course, in the region. First of all, you have the turmoil surrounding you. You have 750,000 refugees in Jordan. You have ISIS cells in Jordan. So a condition that Israel was insisting on in all previous negotiations, that it would maintain a presence in the Jordan Valley. And the Palestinians were saying, no, not your troops. We'll take NATO, we'll take American, we'll take anybody, but we won't take your troops. That's now not an issue anymore. Mm-hmm. There's going to be Israeli troops there. But
I'd like to know whether you think it is reversible or not. Because these things come and go. I mean, it looks very ominous at the moment, but, you know, the ISIS threat could disappear in a few years.
But Israel has becoming, and maybe I'll take my point for this, since the early 90s, a more religious country. In the early 90s, 60% of children went to secular schools and 40% went to Haredim schools. Today, that proportion is just reversed. It's the other way around. And that proportion is going to increase. It's not going to go down. Mm-hmm. Besides that, you have a generation of young people that have been the subject of longitudinal studies that are carried out every 4 years. And they find that young people that would be 18 to 25 or so are more hardline than their parents, are less tolerant. And if they had a choice to make between Israel being more Jewish and less democratic, or more democratic and less Jewish, it would go for the former.
Mm-hmm. But don't you think this is really a function of the conflict, and once you diffuse that bomb, things could take a turn for the better?
Well, I don't think you are going to see suddenly the army going from, in the army itself, since the 1990s, late 1990s, the number of recruits has increased fourfold over the national average among Orthodox Jews. There are now, and the same with officers. There are now a number of divisions in the army that are all Orthodox Jews coming from settler families. Mm-hmm. So you have to look at a situation where, at the best, most experts say about 100,000 settlers will have to be evacuated. Maybe out of that 100,000, maybe 90,000 will go easily. But you're still going to be remained with a rump of 5,000 to 10,000 that are going to fight. I mean, the recent increase in Jewish terrorism is kind of a foreshadow of what's coming in the future. And if a prime minister ordered his army to go in and take them out, i.e. fight them, if they are composed, the battalions have settlers, they would be fighting against their families, and they may not obey the order. They may follow the order of their rabbi. Besides, if you did have that kind of clash between armed settlers and the army, that would be coming into people's homes by video every day, 24 hours a day, and people who were not for a two-state solution or anything would suddenly see our army is fighting our citizens. And Israel is held together by so many schisms that the glue that holds it together is its Jewishness. And if these schisms begin to widen, the entire interaction of the country is threatened. President Rivlin just a while ago made a speech where he talked about there being 4 tribes. There being the secular, there being the religious, there being the Orthodox, and there being the Palestinian Israelis, that they all listen to different media, and they all followed different kind of cultural phenomena, that there was little interaction between them. And he was talking about, again, the core of the country disintegrating into different tribal
But
groups.
again, Israel, and also I'm sure that much of your analysis pertains to the Palestinians, who are even more divided than the Israelis, even de facto. You cannot escape similar or parallel situations in the world, most notably in your native Ireland, and you are intimately acquainted with the conflict there and the conflict resolution that took place there. You carried out a lot of research there as well. There were hardliners on both camps in Northern Ireland, both Catholics and Protestants, who rejected outright any type of reconciliation, not an inch, which is, again, a slogan that's common both to Israel and Northern Ireland. Yet, somehow, tell me what it was, they put all their eggs in the basket of peace and moved forward out of some sort of understanding that would be the best way forward.
Okay, in answering this question, I think I'll also be answering the reason why it would not apply to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. First of all, you had the IRA, which had not the support of even the majority of the Catholic nationalist community. You had the presence of 30,000 British troops and 30,000 members of the army, 30,000 members of the reserves. They were fighting about 90,000 people. But the British couldn't defeat them. But the IRA also knew that they couldn't defeat the British. And while they conducted negotiations through the 70s and into the 1980s, they always left the IRA Sinn Féin out of the negotiating table. And it wasn't until the late 90s that they understood that the major player they should have at the table is the player that's responsible for all the violence and the counter-violence. So they brought the Sinn Féin, the IRA, into the process. Now, what resulted from these negotiations? First of all, it's a power-sharing agreement where the nationalist and the unionist community share power equally. So there is a minister and there's a deputy first minister, but they're really equal. Both of their signatures have to go on everything. Any legislation that is passed has to have a consensus of the nationalist members of the legislature and of the Protestant members. It has to be consensus on both sides. Thirdly, the final aspect of it is really a hudna of a certain type, because a ceasefire. Yeah, because there's the clause in the agreement which says that at any future time, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland can call a referendum, and if a majority of people vote to join a United Ireland at that time, then Northern Ireland will become part of a United Ireland. Now, if you can apply all of those things to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, you'd have an ideal one-state solution.
Absolutely.
You know?
No, but didn't it look as bleak in Northern Ireland, I don't know, 30 years ago as it does today in Israel and Palestine?
No, you never had the level of violence commensurate with the level of violence here. The IRA targeted what they call anybody who wore the uniform of the Crown. They didn't target Protestants individuals, but the Protestant paramilitaries, because they couldn't distinguish, there was no organisation with uniforms they could identify, they shot more of individual Catholics than members of the IRA. Mm-hmm. You didn't have the hate level in Northern Ireland that you have here. Catholics and Protestants mingled quite easily in downtown Belfast and downtown Derry.
Well, they do in Jerusalem as well. Jews and Arabs.
Well, you're not talking about Palestinians in the West Bank. You're talking about
right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's Jerusalem Palestinians, so they are Palestinians.
Yeah. Well, right now, if I were a Palestinian, I would make sure I didn't put my hand in my pocket if I saw
sure.
security, and people are afraid of each other. Yeah. So you have massive fear on both sides. You have distrust. And there is no way that Israel is going to allow Hamas free to roam in the West Bank. And I'll take that back a step. In every negotiation that has been conducted, it's been conducted by the PLO or the PA, by Mr. Abbas or Mr. Arafat. And even if they reached an agreement, they can't reach an agreement and say that Hamas is going to decommission its arms. You have to have Hamas at the table. It's a major player. And the British went through this for years. We can't have a terrorist organisation at the table. Mrs. Thatcher, a terrorist is a terrorist is a terrorist. Yet, in the end, they understood if they wanted the compromises that eventually resulted, they had to have the IRA there. So you had compromises on both sides. The IRA did not settle for a united Ireland, which is what they wanted, and the Protestant community did not get what they wanted, that is a guarantee that they would be part of the United Kingdom in perpetuity. Mm-hmm. You don't have that level of trust here. You have two sides that believe that if there were an agreement, that each side would use it as a first step towards taking all of Palestine, if it's Palestinians, or taking over all of Israel, if it were...
But isn't it really the main obstacle in any kind of conflict resolution process to get over the enormous levels of distrust? Had there not been distrust, there would not have been a conflict.
The distrust has grown to a level that is, in my mind, you could call absolute. And I'll give you the analogy that I use. When the Iranian nuclear deal was going down, Israel's voice of you can't trust the Iranians, they break every promise they made, they're cunning, they're devious, they lie, they'll find a way to manipulate this agreement and get their bomb. That's the mindset of distrust of Iranians. Now, if you had an agreement kind of on the table with the Palestinians, that mindset would just move over. And they'd apply the same mindset to any agreement that is reached. These guys, Palestinians, can't be trusted. They'll find a way around the agreement. What are you doing about Hamas? So Hamas has decommissioned its arms. How do we know that? Who's monitoring it? And by the way, in the Middle East, if you want to rearm, all you have to do is clap your hands and throw an order in and tanks
will be rolling into Gaza.
Will come in like on a drone from Amazon.
Yeah.
So rearming on the part of Hamas is not going to happen. And this came to me in one interview I did with Yossi Beilin, a man who put more effort into trying to achieve the two-state solution, I think, than anybody else.
Yeah, the former Israeli minister.
Mm-hmm. When I interviewed him, I asked him why Israel would not allow more than 5,000 returnees and do it under the right of return.
Palestinian refugees.
Or even do it under humanitarian grounds or whatever, but allow more of them to come back, and the number wouldn't threaten the demographic balance. And his answer was, well, you never know.
Never know.
Well, you never know what might happen if you start letting some of them back.
Right, okay.
and any agreement, the same thing would be there. You never know with these Palestinians what they're really up to, what their real agenda is. Now, how do you get rid of distrust? It's built in the last year. Hate levels have come to the fore as never before. But it begins in the schools. You have an educational system in Israel and in the West Bank that parrot demonization of the other, that sees the other as inferior. And this is where the otherness begins. They don't see each other as human beings. Members of high school who finish and become members of the IDF during their reserve duty, they are trained to kill an enemy that they don't know who that enemy is. It's a Palestinian. Shoot him if it's a battle. But they know nothing about the Palestinian. They know nothing about his culture, about their background. In fact, one of the big problems is that when people say we're for a two-state solution, these are the questions that are asked on and off in surveys. And at this point in time, taking 3 or 4 of the recent polls would probably show that no more than 50% of Palestinians and 50% of Jewish Israelis are right now in favour of a two-state solution. Mm-hmm. That's right now. That will vary, but it'll never get up to what it was in the 15 years ago when it was in the mid-60s on both sides.
But don't you think that at some point, I mean, this is, the picture that you paint here is very pessimistic, as if there's really no way out of conflict and we're doomed to live with it forever. But don't you think that at some point, I mean, we are all human beings after all, our desire to get rid of conflict, and not even desire, our fatigue, we don't want, we just any alternative is better. Don't you think that will trump at some point?
Okay. I would call this a form of entrapment on both sides. And it is like waiting at a bus stop for a bus. And you wait 5 minutes, 10 minutes, the bus isn't coming. You wait 15 minutes and you say, that's a long time for the bus to come. Will I walk to the next bus stop where maybe I can get another bus? But I spent 15 minutes here waiting for a bus. Maybe I should wait a little time longer. Mm-hmm. And in psychological terms, that's called entrapment. You don't know which way to go. But if you take the two-state solution again, it's been tried in 1938 in the Peel Commission. A formula was put forward in 1946 by the UN. Formula was put forward in 1967. A formula was put forward in Camp David in 1980. It was put again in Annapolis, and it was up again the last time in the Kerry talks in 2013 and 14. And to get a set of players back and say, you know what, we should have one more attempt to get a two-state solution, even though it's failed on every occasion we've tried it.
So forget the two-state solution. What's the alternative? What's the solution?
Well, I think that the solution is not the point. That is, under what auspices and understandings do you begin a new set of negotiations? And if there is compelling and convincing evidence there that at this point in time, it's 20 minutes past midnight, the two-solution option has gone down the drain, that is taken as the starting point for new negotiations, not going back into the same box they've been in for over 50 years.
Right.
On the Palestinian side, many of their key negotiators have been involved in negotiations since 1991 from Madrid. And in all honesty,
it's a quarter of a century.
I don't see how they have anything more to say. Mm-hmm. They should move aside and make room for a younger generation. And one of the things I put forward in my book is that there could perhaps be a hudna for 20 or 30 years. There'd be no violence. Gaza would get its seaport. There'd be an opening of the societies gradually, and that the major questions, which cannot be resolved now, will be pushed to the next generation, who might think very differently about all of the sacred core values that this generation thinks are ultimately very, very, very important.
Mm-hmm. So give the next generation some sort of, a horizon, a light at the end of the tunnel, so
That's
that, and with the so-called confidence-building measures that would gradually and incrementally lead to a more favourable environment.
Yeah, but I think you've got to be very careful about confidence-building measures because, again, after Oslo, there were confidence-building measures. After the roadmap, there were confidence-building measures. And leading up to the 1913-14 talks, there were confidence-building measures. And all of those confidence-building measures imploded, and the distrust between the two sides increased rather than diminished.
Absolutely.
So, and it goes to the ingrained level of distrust.
I'd like to ask you now one last question before we wrap up. The book, other than an extensive review of the literature and many, many documents, it also contains, based on dozens of interviews with Israelis and Palestinians.
Over 100. With Israeli Jews, with Palestinian Israelis, with Palestinians in the Palestinian Authority, and with members of Hamas in Gaza.
From really across the spectrum, on both sides. I'd like to ask you if you can identify or single out one of them that really blew your mind, as it were, that you thought, wow, this is something that I haven't really heard. It's not really the same old slogans and formulas that they've been repeating since Madrid and since the Peel Commission of 1938. This might really be the way forward.
Yes, and it was one Israeli Jew and it was one Palestinian Israeli. And I won't give their names over the year, but they're both very, very senior people in the negotiating process and have been for a long time. And both men are committed to a peaceful two-state solution. They abhor violence. And in long conversations with them, I said, well, what might be a game changer? And both of them said, in different locations at different times, we may need a better war. We may need a war. Now, if you think about it, now not a war that's being conducted right now, because you can't really call what's going on between Gaza and Israel a war as such. You can't call it a war when 7 people are killed on one side and over 2,000 are killed on the other. There may have to be a war where a significant number of Israeli Jews are killed before the country wakes up to the fact that it really has to do something about this situation, that more and more casualties is going to be the future, not fewer and fewer casualties. And, Germany and France fought each other throughout the 19th century and the 20th century. And they both understood at the end of World War II that they had to curb their nationalisms. And that was the founding block of the common market that evolved into the European Union. Yeah. And today, Germany and France are the key components of that. But it took the lives of 20 million people before they got to that level.
I have to say, Padraig, that I was hoping that this last answer would be the silver lining of our conversation. But I have to say that the bottom line is even more depressing than before.
It's food for thought. Again, in surveys that have been taken since the 2014 wars, as listing the priority of issues for Israeli Jews, the priority has been not getting into poverty, and the conflict gets about 9%. It's not an issue here yet in the sense of people being prepared to, nor have they been educated into the process. The leadership on both sides is not just bad. It's a barrier against any kind of negotiation. Yeah. But on both sides, the public haven't been educated into the process and made part of it. So when you say to either an Israeli Jew or a Palestinian, are you for a two-state solution? They will say, well, yes. Say 50% say yes. But then when you say, well, that would involve, and you start listing out the things that it would involve, the compromises they would have to make, that level of support just begins to drop.
Yeah.
So the phrase two-state solution means different things to different people. There's no common definition of it, except perhaps on the Palestinian side who say we need a contiguous state, East Jerusalem as our capital, and the West Bank and Gaza joined together in one state. They're not going to get that, and they're dishonest about it.
Well, there are much bigger issues like the right of return. Yeah. That is really the...
But they're never, they're not going to get contiguity between the West Bank and East Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And the Israelis say, well, what we'll do is we build a tunnel underneath so you can come up on the other side. That's not a state, okay?
Yeah. All right, Professor Padraig O'Malley, I'm afraid this is all we have time for. But thank you very much for coming in today. You're a professor of peace and reconciliation at the University of Massachusetts in Boston and author of the recently published The Two State Delusion, Israel-Palestine, A Tale of Two Narratives.
Which your readers, if they are interested, can purchase at the American Colony bookstore.
In Jerusalem, and also online.
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
All right. Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
לא קל להאמין, הרגעים מעטים, וצריך את הזמן להבין את סוד הדברים הפשוטים. יש חור בלב שאנחנו רצים כדי למלא, בלי לשאול למי זה כואב וכמה עולה, אם נדע לתת בלי לבקש להחזיר.